Good evening. My name is Frank Goodhue, and tonight we are assembled here with a few people having to do with the Melrose Historical Society, and we're going to discuss the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. And sitting with me right here are Ryan McLean, who is the Director of Veteran Services in Melrose, and Bob Driscoll, who's the Chairman of the Melrose Veterans Advisory Board. And Ryan, why don't we start with you?
How you doing, Frank?
I'm doing pretty good. What type of legacy did the Civil War leave in terms of benefits available to veterans?
Sure. Well, the Civil War really refined and started what we now see as veteran benefits in America. So there was benefits that existed after the Revolution, mostly tied to if you were injured in war or if you were dependent of a veteran. But the Civil War really shaped what we see now. So you see around 1862 or during the Civil War, Congress and Abraham Lincoln passed legislation that allowed for the very common benefits we see today, which are service-connected disability, non-service-connected disability, or what we call pensions. VA medical health care started then. That all of the national cemeteries started then. And here in Massachusetts, Chapter 115, which is a medical and financial benefit that exists so that veterans can get support when they need it.
Do any of today's veteran services organizations have their roots in the Civil War?
A lot of them are structured similar to the Grand Army of the Republic. So the GAR room, which people know from Memorial Hall, is dedicated to this organization. The way they structured themselves was in divisions with local branches, which was then followed by the American Legion during World War I and VFW during World War II. They fought really hard in the 1890s to pass veteran legislation similar to today, the way veteran service organizations fight for increased benefits. And they were able to pass some benefits that still exist today, which is allowing for widows and dependents of veterans to get benefits after the veterans have passed. They were very tied to events like today's service organization are, the GAR. They actually started Memorial Day.
Did the Civil War inspire any veterans events that we still celebrate today?
Sure. As I just mentioned, Memorial Day. Memorial Day was began by the GAR, although there's several different dates. Commonly, it's accepted that the GAR started it. The General-in-Chief, his name was Logan, last name was Logan, gave out General Order 11 to celebrate Decoration Day. And this began in the 1860s, 1868. And what Decoration Day was to honor veterans who had passed, mostly Union veterans at that time, by decorating their graves. And we still do that tradition today on Memorial Day. Memorial Day, we go to the graves and we change the flags. Local organizations continue to do that. Decoration Day slowly turned into Memorial Day as the Union and Confederacy healed their wounds. States started to adopt it, and then after Civil War, it was sort of recognized that they needed a national day of remembrance, and that's where Memorial Day came from, finally accepted by all in the 70s.
I was at that ceremony last Memorial Day. You were heading it up, and I was very impressed. Very impressed, I'm telling you.
Well, it's a big part of my life. It's a big part of Bob's life. Honoring those who sacrificed their lives for our country is something that we should do.
Their lives, they gave everything.
Everything they had. From every war we've had, we honor them all. And that's sort of what Decoration Day has become, is a way to honor all of those soldiers.
Well, Bob, what is your connection to military medicine?
My connection is I serve in a military unit as well as Ryan does. We both are serving. Ryan's in the National Guard, the Army Guard. I'm in the Air Force Reserve. And between the two of us, we have deployments between Iraq, Afghanistan, and Ramstein, Germany, where all the wounded evacuated out of the war zones come to. So that's our association with the military medicine.
What is a medical platform, and how are the medical platforms today similar to the Civil War?
Though medical terminology and scientific knowledge and equipment have changed dramatically since the Civil War, basic principles of the military healthcare system remain the same, and those are to put military personnel right up near the action where the people are going to get wounded, the rapid evacuation of the wounded off the battlefield, and providing adequate supplies of medicines and equipment continue to be crucial in the goal of saving the lives of military members.
Can you give some similarities between the Civil War and how wars are conducted today?
Yeah, there are some similarities in the what we call the levels of care, or today we call them the echelons of care. In the Civil War, they had what was called a field dressing station, and this was the first level of care that a soldier would receive. It was right up close to the battlefield. The wounded soldier would be brought to the field dressing station, and they would be bandaged, and they'd be administered whiskey for shock or morphine for pain. Today we have what's called self-aid and buddy care, where that's the first level of care for the wounded, and it's self-administered between yourself or your buddy taking care of you. The other level of care from the Civil War was the field hospital. In the Civil War, this was usually located in the back of the rear of the fighting, and it was located in a barn or a tent. And the soldiers were triaged into different categories, either mortally wounded, slightly wounded, or a surgical case. Today, our equivalent is either a theater hospital in the Air Force or a cache in the Army. And the other platform that they had in the Civil War was a pavilion hospital. Large number of wounded and sick needed long-term care. And that's similar to today's through the battlefield wounds of today. So they created hospitals in the North and the South to take care of this need of all these wounded soldiers. Today we have, our examples would be like Walter Reed, or VA hospitals across the country would be similar to their pavilion hospitals.
Tell us about evacuation then and now.
At the beginning of the Civil War, they didn't have an evacuation system set up to get the wounded off the battlefield into a level of care. So in August of 1862, a gentleman by the name of Jonathan Letterman, who was the medical director of the Army of the Potomac, created a highly organized system where he used ambulances and trained stretcher bearers to get the wounded as quickly as possible off the battlefield and to a first aid type of system for care of the wounds.
Were the ambulances driven?
There was one ambulance that was two wheels that was pulled by a horse. Another was somewhat like a truck that they would suspend stretchers from the top to help not juggle the patients around too much. So it would sway it. But very similar to what we use today, we use buses where we put the litter patients up and suspend them from stanchions in the bus. So they're very similar to that. Today we'll also use helicopters, trucks, aircraft, any vehicle of opportunity to help evacuate the wounded off the battlefield.
How about the wounds? Are today's wounds much different from the wounds of the Civil War?
The lethality of the weapons has changed dramatically. So precision are the weapons today, but a lot of the wounds are similar as far as of the 620,000 soldiers who died during the Civil War, 2/3 of them died not from bullets and bayonets, but of disease. And that was due to the crowded camps that they were in, the spread of disease in the camps, and poor diets that they experienced in the camps. So a lot of our wounded today, a majority of them are from non-battle wounds. The most common surgery performed in the Civil War were amputations. 3 out of 4 operations during the Civil War were amputations, and there's a lot of that happening today. Back in the Civil War, when a soldier was struck in their arm or leg by a minie ball, the bone would splinter, so the surgeon's only option was usually the amputation. And the survival rate for the amputations, in the first 24 hours, if you had the amputation done, it was 25% would die, 75% would live. If you waited over 24 hours, then it became a 50-50. So getting to them quickly was key. So the amputation saved more lives than it killed, and it was an effective surgery considering the medical knowledge at the time. Today, due to the advances in medicine, due to the body armor we're all wearing, due to the dedicated aircraft that we use to evacuate our wounded, to the tourniquets that every person on the battlefield is carrying in their first aid kit with their bandages, quick clot, we have around a 97% survival rate if you get to your first medical station with a pulse. So it's
That's good.
dramatically improved.
Let's talk about medical procedures used then and now. And if I think of back then, I'm thinking of a butcher knife or a saw.
Some of the tools back then were very barbaric looking. But one of the interesting things I found when I was looking into this and doing a little bit of research was that one of the things that come from the Civil War was embalming. It was not widely used back at that time, but to get some of the dead soldiers back to their families, they would have people set up, and they were either surgeons or pharmacists that would do the embalming. And they estimate somewhere between 10 and 40,000 soldiers were embalmed to get them home to their families. And then after the Civil War, it became a common practice, which is still in existence today.
How can a viewer at home find more information on Civil War medicine?
Believe it or not, I didn't realize how much information there is out there until I did a little research here. And so you can go to your local library, and there's plenty of information out there. But there's also a National Museum of Civil War Medicine located in Frederick, Maryland. So people can visit there or go online and check out what they have.
Well, thank you, Bob, and thank you too, Ryan. And we have a couple of more speakers coming up. So I suspect we'll fade to black and be right back. Well, we're back, and we have two more interesting people to interview. And the first one is Linda Walsh. She's the director of the Melrose Public Library. How do you do, Linda?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm fine. Do you have a local history room?
We do. We have a climate-controlled closed room in the upstairs of the library that we allow people to go into. It's a locked room, so they have to get permission to go into it. And it has a good amount of both Massachusetts history and Melrose history.
Does it contain any Civil War era items?
Yes. We have, obviously, we have many books. One notably interesting item that we have is the wedding nightgown that was owned by Mary Livermore, who is one of our Melrose Civil War celebrities. So that's something you wouldn't expect to find at the library. We also have her autobiography. She was a nurse in the Civil War, and some histories of Melrose from that time period.
There used to be a Mary Livermore school. I think it was on Franklin Street.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you have a nightie, you said.
I said it was odd, yes. Yes, we do.
Yeah. Are there any Civil War books for children at the library?
There are. We actually have an extensive nonfiction collection for children, for younger students as they're starting to learn. And we also have some picture books and some really great fiction books. Our children's librarian was telling me about this one. It's one of her favorite books for teaching the really young kids about stories of the Civil War. and it's a great teacher resource for reading aloud, and it's illustrated, so it's a nice introduction.
I don't get the title. Pink and Say. What the,
Those were the names of these two boys
I
who
see.
were
Oh.
in the soldiers in the war.
I see. They were soldiers. They look like youngsters.
They are young. They were about 14 or 15 in this story.
Look at that. Does the library have any of its material on display for this month, which is the 150th anniversary?
Yes, we do. We actually have chosen to put on display some Civil War era fiction, and we have a display of that in the front lobby, which we are replenishing every day because it's just going off of the shelves. And then we will also be having John's display coming up, which will be a much more extensive display next week.
We'll get to you in one more, one more minute. Are there any of your historic materials available online?
Yes, we just recently, as we were preparing for these activities, we have gone through many of the items that we have in our local history room, and a lot of them that are no longer in copyright are available online through Google eBooks or through the Internet Archive. So you can go online, and rather than handling some of the old delicate material just from home, you can go online and look it up and read it right there.
Doesn't
which is
skin
great.
oils cause them to deteriorate faster?
Yes, so it's great when you have the option to read it without having to
Yeah,
touch
that's
it
good.
as much.
Yeah, there's a thing to photograph, all that stuff.
Have to try.
John Webster is our next guest, and he's a former veterans agent in Malden. He's an artist and a photographer. And John, you have a display at the library, I understand.
Yes, I was invited through the Melrose Veterans Advisory Board, and Ann Hackett and the Historical Society contacted me a while ago and asked me if I would be interested in setting up a static display. I met with Linda, and I have her permission to bring it to the Melrose Public Library on October 9th. We haven't finalized the end date for that, but it probably will run almost a month that it'll be there and open to the public during the library's hours. And what it will consist of is photographs of quite a few of the Civil War graves that are in Wyoming Cemetery, as well as some of the historical Civil War statues that I've found throughout the state. And they're absolutely incredible and worth coming to see, because when you photograph them and you look at the detail of them and you see that green oxidation that these statues get, but even more than that is the features of these statues, and you realize how young some of these people were. And very interestingly, the Melrose Memorial Hall allowed me to go into their archives and photograph 75 of the Civil War soldiers. They have 3 large panels of photographs of the Civil War soldiers. And when I started to photograph them, I realized that some of the names were familiar to me because I had photographed their graves. So now I have faces to put with the graves. There's also in Wyoming Cemetery a Medal of Honor recipient is buried there. And what I'm hoping that people will take away from the exhibit is the recurring theme in all wars is the sacrifice that's made for the freedoms that we all enjoy. And there, in that particular, in Wyoming Cemetery, that grave of the Medal of Honor recipient is Hazelton, I believe is his last name. But it's one of the most incredible Medal of Honor recipient graves you'll ever see, at least that I've ever come across, because there's also 3 Medal of Honor recipients buried at Holy Cross Cemetery in Malden, and there's another Medal of Honor recipient buried at Forestdale Cemetery in Malden. But the one in Wyoming Cemetery, the base of it, if you've ever seen a Medal of Honor, the base of his grave is the shape of the Medal of Honor. It's absolutely incredible. And the stone is granite, and it's almost oval shape, and embedded in it is the word valor. And it's all oxidized, and it's just incredible to see.
And you photographed that, of course.
I photographed all of it.
Is that at the library?
That'll be at the library. So
When
it's
does your material go on display?
October 9th,
And it'll be there for a month?
about a month, we hope. At least, anyways. But it'll be there sufficient time for people to come and take a look at it. And it's fabulous that Linda already has in place books for people to see, and now they'll be able to, maybe this will entice them to look at it a little bit further and research some of it. And I would encourage anyone who has relatives who's, goes back to the Civil War, that if you have time, there's a great resource in the National Archives that's located in Waltham, Mass. So if you come across, if you're related to any of the names that appear at the library and it tweaks your interest, go up to the National Archives in Waltham and do a little bit more research.
Now, what do you hope that people who come and view your display will take away from the experience?
That they'll realize that there's been sacrifices in this country for many, many years, for all of those freedoms that we take for granted. Even present day, with the young men and women that have served in Iraq and Afghanistan, that the history of men willing to step forward and to do what it takes to protect and preserve our freedoms. And even civil wars, there's always disagreements, whether it's state against state, nation against nation. Wars are probably the ugliest thing that man perpetuates upon one another. But sometimes wars are necessary so that we can enjoy our freedoms, that someone is willing to make the sacrifices that it takes to have a quality of life that it would be nice if it was worldwide. My hope and prayer is that after Afghanistan that we are not involved anyplace else, but this gives us an opportunity to look back at history and to realize that if you didn't have people that were willing to step forward and make the sacrifices, what kind of a world would we be living in? So that's what I'm hoping that people take away from it, that you just take a few moments, a little food for thought, and appreciate what you do have.
Especially those of us who are cavalier about our freedoms. The Civil War, as I remember, was especially brutal. And those men who fought and died and lived, really, they had an awful time of it.
Well, in the Melrose Memorial Hall, in their archives, they have a lithograph of the Gettysburg battle, which was extremely bloody. That will not be on display, but what will be on display is a photograph. I took photographs of it so that people can get a sense and see, the type of battle it was in the open, and men as close as you and I shooting at each other. It's incredible when you think of it. And recently I had a friend of mine tell me that he went to Gettysburg, and you could just, the feeling that he had just standing there. I've never been there, but so that's what you hope people take a look at it and look in the history and understand how brutal it was and what both sides went through.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you both for visiting with us tonight. And again, you got to get down to the library and see this stuff, because I think it's important just to go over our history and appreciate all that others have sacrificed so that we have the life we have today. So again, we'll go to black, and we'll be right back with some more people. We're back, and my next guest is Rick Amirault. And Rick Amirault is a descendant of a Civil War veteran. In fact, that veteran's name was Cornelius Casey.
That's right.
What can you tell us about Cornelius?
Well, Cornelius was an Irish immigrant. We don't quite know the age that he came to Melrose, but he immigrated from Ireland by himself, ended up in Melrose, and then he enlisted in the Army. He enlisted in 1857, and he immediately was sent to New York, and he actually did boot camp for 3 weeks. That's all they did. He drilled and trained for 3 weeks, and then they put him on a train, and they sent him out to St. Louis with his regiment.
That's quite a train ride.
Yeah, it is.
That must probably took a week.
But that was the end of the line. The train didn't go any further than St.
Yeah.
Louis.
Well, where was his first deployment?
From St. Louis, he was sent by wagon train to Leavenworth, Kansas. And from Leavenworth, Kansas, they picked up more supplies, and then they took another trek by wagon train down to Fort Union, New Mexico. From Fort Union, New Mexico, they went to Albuquerque, New Mexico, where they kind of spent the winter. And their first deployment from there, they were sent to Fort Bridger in Utah. And they were sent up there to relieve Johnson's army. A lot of people don't know it, but there was actually a Utah war between 1957 and 1958. So
1957?
18, I'm sorry.
Okay.
You get those confused?
Yeah.
1857. So his first deployment was from Albuquerque, and they marched all the way up the Platte River to Fort Bridger, where Johnson's army was pretty much starving, and they gave them supplies and re-outfitted them.
And what was Johnson's mission?
Johnson's mission, he was sent there by the U.S. government because the U.S. government didn't like what the Mormons were doing. They didn't like the way they practiced their religion. They didn't like their polygamy, and so they thought that they'd install their own governor. So they sent their governor out there. Well, the Mormons kicked him right out of town. When they kicked him out of town, didn't go over well, so they sent Johnson's army out there. Well, it's pretty much in the middle of nowhere, and that's why Johnson's army ended up starving. And that's why his first deployment was to resupply them. And in the end, after they were resupplied, the Mormons relented, and they decided to accept the United States governor as their leader of Utah. So from there, they marched through Salt Lake City, rather victorious, they felt. Not that they fired a shot, and there wasn't a shot fired in that brief war, but that's how it ended up, and from there, they made their way all the way back to Albuquerque.
Did he ever see any battles with Indians?
He did. When they left Salt Lake City, they went more south, and they went through the Arizona desert, which wasn't Arizona at the time. It was all New Mexico. And they made their way back to Albuquerque, and then they were redeployed to Fort Defiance in New Mexico, which was, I think, like 700 miles west of Albuquerque. And it was there they first engaged the Navajo Indians. They had 2 battles with the Navajo Indians, and then the Navajos tried to overrun the fort in, I believe that was 1859 by that time. And they tried to overrun the fort, but the army was victorious. They lost 3 people, 3 of the soldiers, but the Navajos lost 350. And from there, he made his way back to Albuquerque, and I kind of drew it out. It's kind of interesting to see how far he really went in his travels.
Can you bring this over right in front of you?
So you can see he started out from Boston, and he went right down to New York, where he was drilled, and then they went right out by train to St. Louis.
That's this.
Yep.
Yep.
And then he went by wagon train out to Leavenworth, Kansas. That's the next leg. And then he went by wagon train all the way through the prairie, and he talks about that, seeing millions of buffalo, made his way all the way down to Albuquerque, and then you can see where he goes up to Fort Bridger, to Salt Lake City, and then they march through Salt Lake City, come back to Albuquerque, and then you can see he heads out to Fort Defiance.
Yep.
Then he comes all the way back to Albuquerque, and they go south, and they follow the Rio Grande River all along the Mexican-Texas border to Brownsville, Texas. And they put them on a sloop, and they sailed from Brownsville, Texas, all the way back to New York, only to be redeployed and sail all the way back to Pensacola. And in Pensacola, he had his first skirmish with the Confederates. There was a Union fort down there, and they went to to resupply the Union fort, and it was the rebels tried to overrun it, but the Union Army finally prevailed and they took Pensacola. And then they sent him back, all the way back to New York. He made his way back to Washington, and then down in Virginia, where he had his main battles of the Civil War.
Wow, that's quite a trip. I bet he walked a lot of that way.
I think he walked all that way, except the part that he was on the train.
He must have been very glad to see those boats.
So he spent 5 years in the military. 3.5 of the years were spent mostly out in the West, you know, with the engagement with the Indians and his Utah thing. But his last 1.5 years were in battles from Pensacola up to Virginia. And he spent 5 years in the war, so he was let go in 1862 after his battles in Virginia, yet the war was still going to go on for another 3 years. But he had already served his 5 years, so he was let go in Virginia and made his way back to Massachusetts and back to Melrose.
Did they pay him?
You know, I never heard anybody talk about if they got paid or not. But I would like to read, what I have in front of me is his war record, his memoirs that he dictated to one of my great aunts. And he couldn't read or write. So he dictated the whole thing. She transcribed it, and you can actually find it online. If you Google Cornelius Casey, it comes right up. But I'd like to read this because he's in his own words. This is when he came back from Pensacola after being victorious down there, and they came to the Battle of Gaines Mill, which is just outside Richmond, Virginia. So he says, "We did duty with the rest of the men during the Battle of Gaines Mill, Virginia, in which we were heavily engaged. It took place June 27th, 1862. This was considered one of the hardest battles of the war. We contended against double our numbers and held them at bay for 6 hours. Finally, we had to fall back, and we couldn't resist them any longer and crossed the Chickahominy River. The next morning, we took up our march towards the James River. We were drawn up in position several times to resist the enemy. During our march, we arrived at Malvern Hill July 1st, where we had a fine position. They attacked us July 2nd with great force, and which we repulsed very easily on account of our good position. They made repeated assaults, but could not make no impression on our lines. July 3rd, we fell back to Harrison's Landing, where the whole army was assembled. At the Battle of Gaines Mill, we lost Colonel Bossel and 150 men out of 450. The 3rd of August, 1862, a month later, I received my discharge and came back to Melrose, where I lived before the war." And those were his words.
So the Confederate Army kept chasing them and engaging them again and again and again.
Right.
Wow. That's quite a story. And thank you very much for coming in here tonight. We're back once again, and my guest right now is Jim Harrington. And Jim is a former trustee of Memorial Hall and former chairman of Memorial Hall, too. Were you chairman for like 10 years or something?
I was chairman about 15, 16 years and was a trustee maybe 18 years.
Wow. So
just stepped down in June after the 100th anniversary.
I'll be darned. So you know what GAR stands for, don't you?
I at least know that, Frank, yes. The GAR is an acronym for the Grand Army of the Republic, which was an organization that was founded after the Civil War by veterans of the Civil War. It was actually founded in Decatur, Illinois.
And was it an army with,
it was
armed soldiers?
Well, no, not quite, but it was comprised of veterans of the Union side during the Civil War, and it was comprised of men and one woman, it turns out, who served in the Army, the Navy, and what was then called the Revenue Cutter Service, which was a predecessor, I guess, to what we now know as the Coast Guard.
One woman.
One woman.
Is it a fraternal organization?
Well, it is. It was founded on the principles of fraternity, charity, and loyalty. But as the years went on, the GAR, as it was called, became something of a political force. It became affiliated, or really a de facto arm of the Republican Party. And as time went on, they became a pretty powerful influence.
I wonder if that's where the Grand Old Party, GOP Grand Old Party is.
Well, who knows? That I don't know. that I don't know. But they were a nationwide, as the nation then existed, organization, and actually established themselves as the model for later organizations like the American Legion, which came about after World War I, and the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the VFW as we know it, after World War II. So they established themselves in a way that served as a model.
Were all members of the military eligible to become members of the GAR?
Members of the Union side back then, yes.
Yeah. So Marines as well as
Marines,
Army.
Sailors, and Army soldiers.
The GAR was there an organization, a real structure to it?
Oh, there was. On a statewide basis, they were organized into what they were called departments. But so there'd be a statewide GAR organization, and then in the local community, they established posts. And in fact, we had one here in Melrose. It was named after Ulysses S. Grant, a famous Union general and later President of the United States. I think the number was 294, in fact. Now, that predated Memorial Hall, but years later, I think the Grant Post was founded in 1880s, 1890s, and Memorial Hall didn't come into being until about 1912, but that then became the meeting site, and in fact, that upper room, as it's called at the hall, is called the GAR room to this day.
And where was the Ulysses S. Grant Post?
Well,
is that building still standing? I guess.
Well, that GAR room in Memorial Hall is where they met once the hall was built.
All right. Prior to that,
I don't know.
Okay. Well, how prominent was the GAR, and in Melrose, but also nationwide?
Well, it was very prominent. As I said, they became a factor in politics. They were aligned with the Republican Party, and the Republican Party, many of our listeners will know, was the anti-slavery party back then, and so it was the dominant party in the northern states. And as I said, they exercised real political power, and it said that the president couldn't be elected back then without support of the GAR. And in fact, I think 5 or so of the presidents back then were actually themselves GAR members.
Now, did they also lobby Congress?
They did, and in fact, the GAR was probably one of the first advocacy groups in the United States. Following the war, they advocated for pensions for Civil War veterans. They advocated for voting rights for black veterans of the Union forces. They were never successful in getting those voting rights, and took a long time actually to get pensions, but ultimately were very, very successful there.
Tell us about what happened during the Reconstruction period.
Well, during the Reconstruction period, it was a tough time in American history, and some would say that the Republican Party, which was the post-war party here in the States, was a little bit heavy-handed. Over time, the fervor for Reconstruction in the northern states began to decline, and not so coincidentally, there was a decline in the membership of of what was the GAR. They had significant decline in membership through the 1880s and brought in new leadership, and it was that new leadership that sort of resurrected the GAR, and their membership increased to somewhere around 500,000 or so members when they hit their high point in the late 1890s. But because it was an organization strictly for veterans of the Civil War, as the years went on, the membership began to ebb until they lost their last member in somewhere in the mid-1950s. I think it was 1956, and the organization went away.
I have here, I was going to say my notes, but they're your notes. It held a national encampment every year from 1866 to 1946.
They did. From the founding of the organization in 1866, they had essentially a national convention. They called it National Encampment, and in fact probably was in those years. And they were able to do that and sustain it every year until 1946. And then, of course, by then, there were a handful of members left, quite elderly, as you would imagine. And as I said, they lost their last member in 1956 and were succeeded by what was called the Sons of Civil War Veterans. That was, again, open to males only, and you had to be direct union members, again, with a capital U. Yeah. That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So how did the GAR affect Melrose?
Well, of course, we had a very robust post here in Melrose. I think there were something like 200 plus members.
And now we're talking about Sons of Union.
Well, no, these were the actual Union veterans back then.
Okay, we're going back a bit now.
That's right, and it was in the late 19th century. You have to stop and think about that, and early 20th century, where we began to see across the country a lot of memorials built honoring Civil War veterans. Those memorials took many different shapes. In a lot of cases, they were memorials in cemeteries where there were dedicated sections to Union veterans of the Civil War. And in some places, there were statues and obelisks. But we were very fortunate in Melrose. The community back then saw fit to raise the money and build Memorial Hall that we know today, and dedicate that to the soldiers and sailors and Marines, I might add, but it's called the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Building. And that is a direct benefit that came about of having a GAR post here in Melrose that we still enjoy today.
How did our Memorial Hall, which is a significant building, compare with some of the memorials in other cities?
Oh, I think pretty well. As I said, a lot of the memorials for Civil War veterans were things like statues and obelisks and so on. We got a building that the community has enjoyed now for 100 years. And it's a pretty substantial building. It is. It's not by far the best. I'm aware that there's one just like it in Pittsburgh. The difference is that Pittsburgh facility seats something like 2,700 people, which is about twice our size. So we don't have the largest, but I would argue that we have one of the best.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. This
Thank you,
was very
Frank.
informative.
I hope so.
And I will never forget now what GAR stands for.
Very well. Thank you.
And we'll be back with our last guest. Don't go away. We're back again for the last segment in this anniversary celebration. And my guest right now is Phil Kokora. Phil, why don't you tell us a little about yourself?
Well, I've been a resident of Melrose for almost 40 years. I have been retired now for a number of years from Bunker Hill Community College, where I helped start the college starting in 1973, and have been doing things that are fun. Ever since I retired, I have been on the Historic District Commission here in Melrose since it started back in the late 70s, and do a lot of singing in the community in various organizations. Been working with the planning department at City Hall. I've tried to keep active.
Mm-hmm. He says he's a member of the Historic Society, but you're actually one of the board members.
Yeah, that's true. The Historical Society is one of those community organizations which has such good fun celebrating what Melrose has been as a community and where it is now.
Well, tell us a little about the society. What do you do in the community and things like that?
We're a completely private organization, as distinct from some of the things like the Historical Commission, which are official agencies of the city and of the state. We are a gathering of people who are interested in Melrose, who have found it a nice community to live in and are curious about how it got to be what it is today. So we meet 3 or 4 times a year to hear what people have been doing in the way of their own researches, and sometimes bringing people in from outside who've been working on some question that deals with Melrose, either with the origin of the peoples of Melrose, or the development of the neighborhoods, or the architects, or downtown, or a variety of those kinds of things.
Did there used to be trolley tracks on Main Street?
Oh gosh, there were not only trolley tracks on Main Street, but they were on Green and Franklin Street, and they went out on Upham Street, and there was one that went all the way over to Saugus on Howard Street.
Well, what's your role in this 150th anniversary of the Civil War?
Well, it's hard from our perspective, looking back 100 years, to think about how really powerful an impact the Civil War had on the community here in Melrose. When the Civil War started, Melrose was only 11 years old. It had just really declared its separate identity in 1850. And as the war wound down, more and more people coming in here were people who were veterans of the war, people who had married, settled down, wanted to find a place in an attractive community, and in effect are the people who built Melrose. So that the population of Melrose in the latter part of the 19th century and into the early part of the 20th century were all people who had a very, very important remembrance of the Civil War, sometimes pretty traumatic, sometimes very positive in terms of the sense of recovery, not only of the country, but of the building that had gone on after the Civil War. So that this sesquicentennial of the war, doubling up with the centennial of Memorial Hall that we're celebrating these days, is a kind of a reflection of how powerful an impact all that was on Melrose as it was developing in its early days. I was looking at some figures the other day and was struck by something which I've never been able to tie down, but my old notes say that something like 2/3 of the male population of Melrose at the end of the 19th century had been involved in the Civil War. That is, 2/3 of the men who were old enough to have been involved in it. That's an extraordinary number of people, and to think about how powerful an impact that it had.
And were they away at the war?
Many of them were away at the war, and I think some of them were involved in local things like in recruiting and in those kinds of things that, any army depends on those things at the local level.
Was Melrose an agricultural society back then?
Part of it was. It's hard to believe that there were dairies in Melrose that supplied.
I remember one on Upham Street.
Yes.
Kylie's Farm.
And the dairy on Vinton Street.
I don't know about that one.
That was, I think, the first one, and it was a big apple growing area. All those places out on the east side of town that suggest orchards
Like Orchard Lane?
Yeah, Orchard Lane. You know, they were named that for a reason. And there's some wonderful literature which the Society has published, actually, of memoirs of people who grew up in the orchards or grew up being caddies at the golf course, talking about what it was like to grow up in Melrose during those years. And that's part of what we like to do as a society to in effect, help people get a sense of how Melrose came to be what it is.
How do you come across information like that? Is it through letters that somebody finds in the attic and gives to you?
Well, very often it is something like that. And we always think of it as a happy accident. We sometimes don't know anything about it, and somebody says, you know, we've had this collection of uniforms or dresses, or we found this old diary or letters. And Rick's stuff on Colonel Casey is a wonderful treasure trove of that sort of information and that sort of feeling for what happened in the community and how the community developed.
When I saw that picture, I just saw a strong man, this Cornelius Casey. And then he started talking about walking. Mother of God. From the map that he showed, he walked probably half the country.
Well, he must have been a strong guy with a good constitution,
and,
for sure.
Don't you wear your boots out and then your knees start going? And
he may have been young enough when he started, but he lived to ripe years. You know, all of that physical activity was good for him, wasn't it?
Yeah, he looked like he was an old man in the painting. Anything else?
Well, I might say something about how the Historical Society is really focusing on the anniversaries this fall, this season. We're sponsoring a concert in October, on the 18th of October, at the GAR Hall in Memorial Hall.
Of course.
Yeah. A natural place, huh?
Yeah.
The Essex Harmony, which is a group of a cappella singers from Danvers, is going to be presenting an evening of music, some of which was the kind of music that was being sung in the Civil War. The interesting thing to us about this, there's several different things, but one of them is that almost all the music they're going to be singing was music that was composed in this area by local composers, some of whom are virtually unknown except that their names are listed as part of the music. But they wrote local music and sometimes dedicated the music to a particular community they came from. And this will be part of the program because the Essex Harmony will be introducing this as something that came from Topsfield or came from Danvers or came from the communities in the area that they're commemorating. The music itself is very stirring music. It's kind of thing that brings a smile to your face and kind of lifts you up out of your chair sometimes. It's got so much energy.
And I think with wonderful melodies also.
Yes. And it's all done in 4-part harmony with a small group, so that these voices are really good voices that are presenting this. I'm really excited about it. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. Now, you're a singer yourself, so you would be particularly knowledgeable about this.
Well, knowledgeable in the sense of I know enough to enjoy it and really have a good time with it. The fact is they sing without accompaniment, so it's all just the human voice.
One pitch pipe.
Which is very much the way they did it in the Civil War period, of course. Yeah. And the other thing, of course, that we're sponsoring is Rick Amerald's talk on Colonel Casey, which will be in November, November 15th. And that will be at the First Congregational Church in the Fellowship Hall. There's no charge for either of these. People in the community are invited, and we hope people will come because both of them will be interesting programs.
Will this be advertised in
the
papers?
I spent the afternoon putting posters up about it already.
Melrose Patch, maybe.
Yeah. And I think the Free Press is going to be doing an article about it as well. And of course, it'll be on MMTV.
Yeah. Oh, good. Yeah. Well, it sounds like it will really be informative and enjoyable. And I would personally want to hear Essex Harmony. I love singing. I can't carry a tune in a basket, but I really love hearing it.
Come and listen. You may find yourself humming along. It's hard not to.
I hum quietly. Can you think of the title of any of the songs from the Civil War period that really were so wonderful we're still hearing of them today?
Well, of course, the one that everybody knows under different names is the one that used to be called the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which came right out of the Civil War. These days, it's often referred to as "Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory of the Coming of the Lord," and it's sung in secular and religious and popular and patriotic settings all the time. That's probably the most famous of the,
and most recorded. Well, anyway, Phil, thank you for joining us in this celebration of the 150th. How do you say that word?
Sesquicentennial is my try.
I have it written here, sesquicentennial, you're right. I didn't dare try it because I didn't want to muff it, but with his...
You did a beautiful job on it, Frank.
And that is the end of our show, so we hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for joining us.